we started our residency 4 years ago, and so it's evolved just every year. It's going to evolve next year. There are things that we're learning all along the way. So part of what I am going to share with you is don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and maybe we can save you a few steps. And also, though, I'm going to use some illustrations as I was kind of putting this together that are our illustrations, that come out of our life and what we've experienced. And so some of those are good and some of those are not so good, but I just wanted to tell you that I don't want to sound like I'm proud. I just, if I use an illustration about the summit, it's because we all want to grow. And what we learned from other people. And so maybe we can all kind of cross-pollinate today and get better. So just, here's 10 things, okay? And what I'm going to do in this first bit is kind of look from 20,000 feet at the philosophy about this, why we do this, and some practical, some kind of philosophical things about it. And then BJ, who was our first director of our residency and our executive pastor and has a real executive pastor mind, is going to come and talk about very practical things, curriculum, finances, and a lot of stuff like that. And then we'll have time later to have some Q&A. So here's 10 kind of 20,000 feet thoughts about starting a residency. First of all is to start with a foundational vision. So had the starting the summit 22 years ago now. The first week of the summit, I was just praying, and the Lord, in the way that He speaks to me, just said to me, He said, "Hey, Bill, the summit's not about the summit." And I said, "Well, okay, it really feels like it's about the summit right now because we got to find a place to meet and etc." But I mean, it just do that whole first few years, the Lord just kept saying to me, the summit is not about the summit. And I thought that was kind of presumptuous to say out loud. Every once in a while I'd say to our elder team that statement. But what it just did for me, and I was older, of course, when we started, I was, 42 or so, is it makes me think intentionally beyond our church. And so in line with that, I think there's a foundational vision that we need to have of unselfishness, that this is just not about our church, and that is a desire to live and work for the kingdom, for the sake of the kingdom, and not just the summit. I don't want the Summit Church name to be known. We want the name of Jesus to be known, right? And also, I think if you think this way, and you're here today, I know, because you're guys who think this way. You wouldn't be sitting in this room if you weren't guys who think this way. But that this is not just about growing our church, Now, I would say to you that every time we've planted a church, we've grown. And every time we have sent 100 people over here or 180 over here, within a year or year and a half, we have recouped all those people and then some. It's an amazing phenomena. So I think there is something to that. But that's not the reason. It's not just, we're not doing this just to grow our primary location. So I think just having kind of a vision that's bigger than your church, that's real kingdom-centered, is just really, really critical and really important. If that's not there, even a residency gets to be about your church, And I just don't, it's just me, I don't believe the Lord really blesses that. I believe He blesses a kingdom vision. Here's a second thing, and that is, and these are not in order, is to begin to think about developing replicatable components. So when we started the summit, I didn't know what we were supposed to be, but I I'd pastored for years. I really knew what we didn't want to be. And so we began to layer in year after year, okay, we think the summit ought to be this, and this is what we value. And you know how that is in church planning. If you've done that, you just kind of layer that and tweak it, and it gets better and better. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I just thought, I think we're in a groove here, in a rhythm, for the first time, that we really know who we are. You know, our unique contribution, what's our passion, and it had been developed over the years. And then we started thinking, we ought to put this, since we think it's valuable, and that's maybe our contribution to the kingdom a little bit, we ought to design this and plan for this with replication in mind. So, in other words, if you're thinking about your discipleship plan, why not think about, let's develop a discipleship plan that's not just for the summit, but could be replicated in other places. I think right now we're changing our discipling plan. I'm really excited about it. And we're using some of Robbie Gallaty's stuff that he's developed in a replicatable way. And that made it very easy for us to take components of that and really use them. So we want to be those kinds of churches, right? And I think thinking that way is really important. You have a culture in your church, whether you plan to or not, and you're here because you have a culture that you believe is worth replicating. We want to plant some churches, and we want to be able to influence pastors and church planners with our DNA. You know, several years ago I wrote this little book, The Presence-Centered Church, and I wrote it because that's who we are at the summit. That's our passion, that's our burden. May not be somebody else's burden, but that's our burden. And so when I'm training church planners, that's one of the things I want them to get. And if they want to go to another church planning residency and get something else, they can, but this is what we believe is really critical and essential for planning a church. So I think thinking replication is really important. And there's a whole lot to that, even just in materials and the way you say things, the way you design things. So that's really important. Thirdly is, and maybe this is most important, is see personal multiplication or discipleship as a foundational value. Okay? So one of the VPs at NAM, I've discovered everybody at NAM is a VP. They're a VP of something, you know. And so one of the guys called me, a great guy, and he said, I think at the time he told me, out of all across the Southern Baptist, there were only at that time about 14 or 15 residencies. So he was saying, what do you do? How are you guys doing it? But then he said, my main question is this: are you developing any kind of pipeline to fuel that residency so that you're raising up in your church? He said the most important thing we're interested in now is finding how churches are developing people to get them to find the candidates for residency, so you don't have to go out and recruit somebody from, you know, Colorado or something to come be in your residency, but these are homegrown guys. And we've been talking about that at the summit. We really had some components we could identify that were kind of discipling pathways, you know, for that, and a pipeline for that. But we hadn't formalized it yet. But then I started thinking about it, and here's one of these statements. I don't want you to misinterpret why I'm saying it, but I realized we have had 70 lay people that have come up through our church and gone to the mission field as full-time missionaries. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And we've had, I don't know how many, probably a dozen that have gone and planted churches. And I thought about that with this NAM guy. As I was talking, I'm kind of going through all this in my head. And finally I said to him, well, we are by the grace of God raising up people in our church. And I think the reason is that from the beginning of the summit, we've had a discipling culture. So they're just, all of our guys on our staff and our elders and our key leaders, we're always thinking about who are the next guys, who's the next in the next generation, who's the guy I need to disciple, who's somebody I need to pour into. That's really a strong component, whether it was planned or not, in our culture, and we're always challenging guys to take the next step. You know, we spent a year studying how Paul and how Jesus discipled people. And we discovered what we call the big five things that they always did. They always cared for their disciples. They always prayed for their disciples. They always poured truth into their disciples. But one of the things that was fascinating that we saw, they always challenged them with vision. There was always vision casting. I mean, Paul's saying to Timothy, stir up your gift. You know, there's more in you. Do this, do that. And so I think, here's the thing. If we start a church planting residency, but we're not discipling anybody, then it's not going to go well. It's just not going to go well. But if we have a discipling culture that has developed in our church, whatever measure, then I think that's going to be the undergirding fuel for a further level of discipleship in a church planting residency. Does that make sense? So I just think that, if I don't say anything else, I'd put a star by that one, because I just think it's really, really critically important that as leaders, we think about not just starting another little side program out here, okay, but that this is an extension of who we are as a church. So I think thinking of multiplication, personal discipleship, as a foundational value. But here's, to take that a step further, is to see church multiplication as a foundational value. I'll tell you just a little bit of our story is, of course, the summit was a church plant. It was an unintentional church plant that we started the summit in 2 weeks. So that's really not the way to do it. But the Lord was gracious. And so we had the kind of a church planting DNA in our soul from the very beginning. And we had a deep desire to reach the next generation and reach as many people as we could, just like you do. And so, I don't know when it was, maybe 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I started hearing about multi-site, the multi-site movement, and what I heard, the stats that day that I heard were that 8 out of 10 church plants fail, but 8 out of 10 multi-site campuses were succeeding. So it just piqued my interest. And to be honest about it, the summit, our church had kind of plateaued. There were some reasons for that, but we kind of plateaued right where we were. And I was thinking, okay, how can we continue to grow, reach more people? So we started going to conferences and talking to guys and studying it out. Okay, what would it? We went to a conference in Chicago, took all of our team and our elders, and just started ruminating over this. It took us several years to see, okay, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? And and then it just made sense to us that if Jesus' method of reaching the world was making disciples who made disciples who made disciples, which, as you know, is not addition but is multiplication, and that whole principle, then it would make sense that there was a value in planting churches that plant churches that plant churches. And one of the real influences in my life about this was Bill Wellens. Bill was the founding pastor at Fellowship Bible Church, and he and I are good friends. And and so I went over to Bill one day, and I just sat down and I talked to him. I said, "Tell me about what's happened." So when he kind of left his day-to-day role at Fellowship, he and Robert Lewis developed Fellowship Associates, and Robert did men's fraternity leadership stuff. And Bill's role, they wanted to start a church planting residency. Well, this was 20 years ago, nobody had church planting residencies. I mean, he was on the cutting edge of this. And he said to me in the course of that conversation, he said, "Bill," I said, "Well, how's it gone? I mean, tell me about it." He said, "Well, to date we've planted 120 churches, and only 5 of those have failed. And I knew every one that was going to fail. And I told the pastors that were in our residency, you don't need to be the lead pastor." And they did it anyway, and all 5 of them failed. But 115. Now that's remarkable. But then he said, you know what the cool thing is? He said, those 115 churches are all planting churches. And some of them now are developing residencies where they're sending out multiple planters. And he said now that's spread into Latin America and spread into Africa. And, well, I want to tell you something. You'll never stop that. I mean, Bill Wellens will be dead and in his grave, right? And that multiplication of churches and that mindset of a church planting movement, and I don't mean movement that's the biggest movement in the world, but our little niche of the movement of God. If you plant church planting churches, that's just going to go on and on and on and get exponentially bigger. So for us, that was a real significant change in our philosophy at the summit. And by the way, we planted our church. Our first attempt of that was a video venue deal we were going to do in Jacksonville, and it completely failed. I mean, we lasted about 2 years. We reached some people, but about 1.5 years into it, we said this is not going to succeed. We had the wrong leader. We're not a video. We decided the video venue wasn't really us. We couldn't do that real well, and we wanted live teaching pastors at every campus, that we could train up pastors that could really lead those churches, and we liked a little different model. But it was the most important church plant we ever did, because we learned more about church planting through that failure than we would have learned any other way. And I had one of my main buddies at the summit say to me after that, about 1 year after that, he said, "Well, you're not going to try to do that again, are you?" I said, "Oh yeah, we're already making plans, and we've learned a lot." And then we planted in Conway. We sent about 100 people up there to Conway that were all living in Conway. And we thought, well, what are going to be the ramifications at the summit? And we grew by 200 over the next 1.5 years in Little Rock. We gained those 100 plus 100 more. And then we sent 180 to Benton, and we thought, boy, this is really 3 years later, it really had an impact. I mean, I'm just telling you, it has a financial impact. You're taking some of your best, most pioneering leaders, and sending them out to plant a new church. But in the next 2 years, we've gained all those back and then some. So and here's another one of these, please don't misunderstand this statement. So this gal calls me one day and she said, "Hey, it's Bill Elliff from the Summit Church." "Yeah." She said, "I want to interview you for Outreach magazine." And I said, why do you want to do that? She said, "Well, you're in the top 100 fastest growing churches in America." And immediately I said, oh, yeah. I said, this happens sometimes. I said, you're trying to get Summit Church in North Carolina. I said, that's J.D. Greer's church. And she said, no, it's you. We've got the stats on it. It blew me away. And we're not the largest church, but the rate of growth, and listen, every bit of that was related to church planting. We were plateaued before. We weren't the fastest growing anywhere, but the decision to multiply and plant churches, and for us, the multi-site decision created tremendous potential for growth because you're just opening up new venues, and there's all kinds of reasons why that's true. So there's a philosophical mindset about multiplication that's got to be, I think, if we're going to do this, again, it's not a little program out here that we decided to do because it's the cool thing to plant churches now. It is a mindset of personal multiplication and church multiplication so that we can see exponential growth of the kingdom for the glory of God. And that's very, very important. And then a third, fourth thing, fifth thing, whatever this is to learn from others. Again, I told you about BJ and I going over talking to Bill Wellens, and when we came off of that, we didn't really know a lot of people that were doing this, and Bill was close and he was our friend, and so we made a decision. One morning, I can remember this like it's yesterday. In an elder meeting, we meet at 6 o'clock on Thursday mornings, and about halfway through that meeting, we made a decision to take some money and to send BJ over to be trained by Bill Wellens and how to do their residency. And I said to the guys, and I totally would say this even stronger today, that may be the most important decision that Summit Church ever made in her 22-year history. Because just think of the possibilities of multiplication and replication. We could sit around and just think about the summit and how can we get a little bigger and reach a few more people. But if we think we're going to take everything God's given us and give it away and train guys who will go build church planting churches, then this is a big decision. And the little bit of money we spent to have Beej train with Bill Wellens has paid off a million times already in just the first 4 years in terms of the kingdom investment of that. So the first year that we did this, BJ, did you go get the multiply training the first year? The end of our first year. So we did a lot of stuff that he had learned from Bill, and then multiply finally got solidified with NAM. Their church planning, they have a 11, 12 session planting training module. Some of you probably already, have any of you been to that already, gotten certified in that? So it's really good. And but I'll refer to this here in a minute, for me, I felt like if that's all we did, it would be deficient. There were things that we thought were really critical in training a church planter, that if we just had a course and it was 12 weeks long and we, just kind of put these guys to the mill and sent them out, that they're not going to get. Listen, a lot of the guys we've had in our residency have never pastored before. They don't know how to preach. They don't know how to go to the bed of a sick person. They don't know how to disciple people. It's amazing the spiritual illiteracy with a lot of guys out there that want to go plant a church. And we wonder why they fail, And by the way, you help me with this, Tim. Last time I was at NAM, they said that figure of 8 out of 10 church plants fail had now flipped so that 8 out of 10 church plants are succeeding. Not just multi-sites, but church plants, and the single reason is training and support. So that what's happened is now we've developed some training systems and some assessment of guys so that we can kind of weed out guys that we really realize are not going to make this. They're not really suited to do that. There's a particular DNA, I think, for a church planter. And the support systems are creating this environment across our country where church planting is exceeding at a way different rate than it did before. So we wanted to do the best we could. For us, we just thought, let's do the best we can, pour it into these guys. And for us, that determined that we wanted to do a 9-month training, and we wanted to do it from September to May, and then help these guys really get ready in the spring and raise money. And we were right there with them, coaching them up and helping develop materials and all that kind of stuff with them, so that we could graduate them out in May and they could go plant. But in that process, we wanted to put more. So we use the Multiply material. It's really good. Multiply material is really good. And everybody in this room, do we do training here or do they go to NAM now? Yeah. So this is a 2-day thing, and BJ's been trained in it. I've been trained in it. It's really good, and they kind of run you through the training pretty quick. But what they did in developing the Multiply training was they took a huge group of successful church planners and said, what do you think we need to put in here to really prepare these guys? So it's church planners really designed the curriculum, and I think that's really wise. And it's very good material. I just think it's not enough. And if you have the ability to do more, you ought to do more. And again, you've got your own culture and DNA that if you believe in that and your church, you want to pour that into these guys, and that takes a little more time. So learn from others. Here's number 6, and that's utilize your best men in your church and on your staff and around the country to train these guys. So BJ led our residency the first year. In my changing role there, he was doing it as an executive pastor, so it was kind of, a side thing for him. He had to divide his time, and Bill Wellens kept telling us, he said, you guys can do that for a while, but if your residency really gets successful, you need a man that's dedicated to that. And what was fascinating to me was, as this thing grew, I said, I want to do that. I really see this, for me, as a very natural progression to be able to train pastors in that way and multiply. And got very excited about that. But the point I'm trying to make is, I don't teach every week for nine months. So we have BJ's trained in Multiply. Dave is now there at the summit and is trained in Multiply. So they do some of the different Multiply sessions. We bring in guys. I brought in last week Stephen Smith, the pastor at Emmanuel, who taught preaching at Southwestern for years and is a great preacher and particularly great at helping guys understand how to build that out of the text. Well, he spent a whole day with our residents. It was gold. I mean, it was the best thing you could imagine. In a few weeks, we're going to bring in Robert Lewis, who's going to spend a day talking with our residents about how to build a patriarchal instead of a matriarchal church. In other words, how do you build a church that really develops men and male leadership? Not to say there's not, you know what I'm saying by that, not to denigrate female leadership, but many of our churches are all matriarchal. They're all led by women and in the church because they're the most godly. Frankly, they're the ones who'll do stuff while the men are sitting on the sidelines and glad to be so, like Adam, go passive. So I just say that we use a team approach in our teaching. And I think it's real beneficial to do that and to bring as many authorities. And what I've discovered is when I call a guy and say, I called John McCallum the other day, and I said, John, he's written this book on 23rd Pastorate. It's a great book. I said, hey, would you come and spend a day just talking to these guys about how to shepherd people? And it's going to be dynamite. I mean, it's just going to be, that's his heart. That's his life message. And what I've discovered is any guy that is passionate about an area like that loves to come train our residents. And we pay them a little money, give them a gift card or whatever, but we pay them some money to come and teach for that day. But I think it really makes our planning residency more robust to have all those different voices and a team approach. And those guys don't want to listen to you all day, once a week, every week. I'm just telling you, they're going to get tired of you. And when we need to add others to that mix. Here's another thing, and this is a huge issue. Are you touching on this some? So, prayerfully recruit capable men. This, in my opinion, this is the hardest part of starting a residency. How do you find good guys that are going to make it? I have no desire to spend thousands of dollars training a guy who's going to come into May and say, well, I don't think I can do this. But that's happened to us. It happened the first year. And we were so anxious to get somebody, and we were just figuring out how to recruit people that I think BJ and I both would say we didn't really vet this guy real well. He had some family issues that were going on that were mitigating factors in that. And he just didn't make it. He washed out. In fact, we were the ones that came to him and said, you don't need to plant. You need to get your house in order. We just had to have that tough conversation with this guy. Well, that wasn't on him, that was on us. That we hadn't vetted him well. So recruiting is really key. Number one, I think it's only accomplished in prayer. I think God knows who should be in your residency, and so we need to ask Him. And we need to really fast and pray and say, Lord, bring us the men that you know would benefit from being in our residency, and the kingdom would benefit from that. And we need to keep our eyes open. We need to be asking around. When we come to evangelism conferences or something here, that I see that as my cooperative program dollars designing a meeting that I can recruit people at for the glory of God. And so I'm walking around, and getting to know guys, and just, I'm not making that sound a little more aggressive than it is, but I've just got my antenna up, looking for hot-hearted men maybe guys who are pastoring, but they're really frustrated because they're really planters and they want to go plant. And I think the greatest thing that could happen is what we talked about a moment ago, is really developing a pipeline from within your church so that you're raising up guys in your church. This guy that I talked to that was the VP at, I wish I could remember his name, you would know it, Tim at NAM, who was a great guy. He said to me, Bill, you are right where Cornerstone Church in Ames, Iowa who started Salt Company and has exploded in church planting. You are right where they were about 5 years ago. And when they solidified their pipeline, everything changed. So we're talking about that right now. We've got an informal pipeline, but we want to make a more formal within the church. And to me, that goes down into the student department. I mean, that's looking at high school students and saying, here's a guy that's got a gifting. He's our own, one of the sons of the ministry here at the summit. He's got our DNA. He's grown up in it. And so we want to help him. Hey, go to college, but come intern here in the summer with our youth ministry so we can get to know you more and see this. And when you get to this spot, hey, the residency's open for you, and we want you to come back and be a part of the residency. So the more we can do that, the greater it will be. And I was going to say to you, by the way, when you were talking a minute ago, Tim, that if any of you have some great guys and then you decide not to do a residency, please call us. Send us some great guys if you've got them. Or if you say, hey, we're 2 or 3 years away from this, and we got a guy that's ready to go now that should be in a residency, we'd love to talk to them and help them, because that's the hardest thing. And I want to tell you something. As I was talking to Bill Wellens last night, actually, and Bill said the landscape around church planting residencies has dramatically changed. And it used to be there were only a few places where guys could go to get trained. He said we used to get 300 applications for our 6 spots. He said then we started getting 100 applications for our 6 spots. He said now we get 40 applications. And he said about 30 of those you can just set over another pile real quick. But he said the pool for residents is shrinking a little bit because, and he said this is a great thing, because residency training programs are starting up all across America. Everybody's thinking the same way, like we are in this room today, saying, hey, this makes sense. We want to do this. This is an extension of our church. And but it makes the pool of potential residents a little shallower. And that's why we need to figure out how to raise them up from within more and more in our churches. Make sense? I'm just going here, right? We're videotaping this, so I'm just rolling. Here's an 8th thing, and boy, I couldn't be more passionate about this, and that is to give men not just practical tools, but spiritual tools. So, if there's one thing, and I don't mean to dish the multiply material because we use it, love it, and it's very, very helpful. If there's one thing that when I went through the training over there with NAM that I spotted that I thought this is deficient, it was in this way. So NAM, in my opinion, that material is fabulous in practical training. Execution, long-term planning, just all these different kinds of things, how you launch, building your core team, just a lot of different things like that. What I didn't, and admittedly we were going through this in 2 days, but what I didn't hear a lot about was prayer, your walk with Christ, how critical it is for you to be spiritually where you need to be if you're going to lead this church. So, I was reading one day where Jesus talked about the wine and wineskins, and he says, everybody loves wine in his day, needed wine, but if you take new wine and you put it into old wineskins, it bursts and you've lost everything. And there's so much in that passage that says stuff to us about what our wineskins should be like. But if I can say it like this, I've seen church planners that were phenomenal on the wineskin. I mean, they had the coolest wineskins in the world. Great looking wineskins. Beautiful, capacity was great, looked cool, made out of the best material. It was all there, but there was no wine. The presence of God was not there in their church. So you can build that kind of a church, and you can get it going. You can maybe even grow a church in some way. But I don't think you're going to build what God wants. Then, I have planners that are all about the wine. They're walking with the Lord, they're praying, they're holy, they have that great emphasis, but they don't have any wineskins. You know, they don't have any structure. They're not guys that are wired to think about, hey, we got to develop a system here to assimilate people into our church. And when a guy comes for the first time, what do we do? What are our steps 1 through 10 of getting guys from the front door into a small group? And he just has no wineskins. I don't think that church, you know, personally, I'd rather hang out with that guy than the wineskin guy. Some of you would like to hang out with the wineskin guy more than the wine guy, but you just need both. You can't compromise on either one of those. And again, I was talking to Wellens about this last night, and he said something that I knew, but it really reminded me. He said, Bill, our whole church planning residency is built around raising up godly leaders. It's raising up leaders. Because a leader can lead anything. And that is just a profound statement to me. And he said, what I'm afraid happens in some residencies is we don't give necessary emphasis on developing this guy as a leader, right? So his heart is right, his marriage is right, he understands leadership principles, he knows how to build a team, you know, he's not proud, he's not self-serving, it's not all about him, it's not about his name. All those are just leadership principles that you and I know. But here's a guy who's 24 years old and he comes in your residency, he didn't know that, you know. He may have the raw material, but there's a lot of, you know, a few weeks ago, I spent the first hour with our guys just discipling them. And they're my discipleship group for those 9 months. And so we were going around just sharing and needs and praying together. And I just picked up something in every guy around that table. And I had handouts and I had all my stuff ready, you know. And while they're talking, I'm scrambling, pulling up something on my computer that I had done before. And I said, hey guys, I just want to change gears a little bit, and I want to spend today talking about brokenness. Because God can't use unbroken men. He never has. And brokenness is the surrender of the will to the will of God. That's what real brokenness is, I think. So we spent the whole day, I'm telling you, there were tears, there was repentance, there was confession, and by the end of the day, I thought, okay, we've made a deposit in these guys that they really need spiritually. And such a joy to do that, you know, because the Lord has taken me through a lot of stuff where I've had to learn that brokenness, you know, and I just realize now brokenness is a lot more important than a lot of other things. And a man who's really surrendered to the will of God. So this is why, you know, a few years ago I wrote this book called The Present-Centered Church, because this is a value to us at the Summit, and it's a huge value to me that I believe that everything flows from God's presence. And if you've got His presence, then you've got everything that matters and lasts, right? You got everything you need. If you don't have the Lord's presence, you don't have anything that matters and lasts, right? I mean, how many of us have been in a worship service or gone into a church somewhere and God was 1,000,000 miles away and the glory of God has departed? You know, as one guy told me one day, Pastor, if we do that, God's going to write Michelob over the doorpost. And so, but you know, Ichabod, the glory of God has departed. It's Moses saying, Lord, if your presence doesn't go up with us, I don't want to go up. I got nothing, right? So to me, this is a spiritual value. And I want our residents, before they get out of those 9 months, to be thinking, man, if we don't create a church where the Lord is pleased to come and dwell and settle down, then they're going to go out here and just build the best they can. And God will bless. You know, He wants to grow His church and all that. But if we teach them that spiritually, and my first point when I'm spending a day or two talking with the guys about this is, okay, you can't build a presence-centered church if you're not a presence-centered guy. If you don't know how to walk daily in the presence of God and experience the presence of God, you're not going to lead anybody else there, right? So I want to show you how to do that. What's the role of fasting and prayer and the Word of God and accountability with other men, and how do you remove the confession and repentance? What's the role of that in the pastor's life? So I want to build him spiritually, and then we start talking about wineskins. How do you build environments in your church that make the presence of God welcome? We might build environments that don't invite the presence of God, but we want to build environments that really invite the presence of God. Those are some wineskins, but it's also some spiritual understanding and passion from the pastor. So there you go. I just think train them spiritually, not just practically. And again, I'd put a star by that one personally, because I think that could be our fault line as church planting movements begin to happen, is that we got church in a box and we're going to train anybody and we can do it in 12 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever, and then we throw these guys out and they don't have the spiritual reservoir. Church planting, as you know, is very, very hard. And the enemy is coming like a flood to keep that church from being started in Bologna or wherever. And so if we don't equip guys spiritually to handle that and the things that are coming, man, it's our bad, right? And he tubes out there because his family's not good. And we never picked up on it, or we saw it and we knew their family wasn't healthy, but we just thought, well, we got to get these church planners out because we told the church we were doing it, and we send this guy out, and he gets with his wife in the rigors and the pressure of church planning, and 6 months later he's tubed. My son David and my other son Daniel are planting a church in Seattle. They've been up there for 5 years. They apprenticed for a year. They started their core group, and so about 2.5 years ago they launched, and the Lord is really blessed. It's going really well. But David said to me the other day, he said, Dad, in the last 5 years, he's now, by the way, their church, 2.5 years old, is the third oldest Southern Baptist church in Seattle. Isn't that crazy? And he said, I've watched 10 church planners while I've been here come to Seattle, try to plant a church, and go home. So this is not, if we don't have guys spiritually equipped, and one of the values that Dave has, frankly, is he and I talk 5 times a week. He's got support. He's got somebody that's an ongoing mentoring with him. Well, that's what your church planting residency can provide. It's you send these guys out, but it's not just sitting them out in May and saying bye. Hope everything goes well. It's we're going to stay with this guy and help mentor him, encourage him. We're going to go visit his church and get our eyes on the ground to see what he's doing and how we can help him along. So train them spiritually as well as practically. Here's a 9th thing. We're almost to the end. Lead your church to embrace this multiplying model and celebrate often. I don't know how to say this. I'll just kind of bumble it out here for a minute. But there's some things we do, I've done as a pastor, that was on my heart to do, really wasn't on the church's heart to do, but we started it over here, and we might reference it every once in a while, but the church never really bought in fully to that. So to me, this takes the training of our church, right? It takes vision casting to say, hey, we really believe in multiplication personally, and we also believe in multiplication corporately as a church. And so guess what we're fixing to do? And here's why we're doing it. And man, this is so exciting. And by the way, it's going to take some money. It's going to take some money. But you could not make a greater investment, I'm saying to my people, than to invest in church planting churches. Just think of this. We cast this vision for this. Well, what I've discovered, at least in our experience, is our church has gone nuts about this. They love this, you know. It's the average lay guy. Now take out the lost guys that are in your church, and there's plenty of those, you know, chaff that's in there. Take out the ornery people in your church. I've lived with some of those in my life. But the hot-hearted Christian in your church is really excited when their pastor thinks about the kingdom and not just the church. Has that been your experience? They get really pumped about that. I remember one time years ago at the summit, we have not at the summit, but in Little Rock, we've had a 25-year prayer movement among pastors in the city, cross-denominational, and early into that, we did a big event. We cooperated in a thing called ShareFest, and we remodeled, I don't know, like 300 schools or something in the city, or some crazy number. Wasn't that many. I don't remember how many it was. Filled up every clothes closet, gave $500,000, all these churches together, to bless nonprofits in the city. Then we came to the arena. It was Altel at that time, and 60 pastors got up on the pulpit area together in the arena. There were about 8,000 people. First thing we did was confess our sin for not leading to be the church we should be in the city. But I had multiple church members come to me and said, you know, I've kind of wondered when you guys were going to wise up and get together. They knew. And in the business world, they know you cooperate with the people and to create greater success. And so when our people hear, hey, we're doing this not to just grow our church, we're doing this to grow the kingdom, they're on board. And we have to make an ask financially. And maybe just have a whole initiative to raise money for the residency, and BJ will talk more about that. Or maybe you tie that to something else. So we're doing this, we got to build this education wing out here, but we're also going to invest beyond our church into this church planning deal. Well, that resonates with people, I think. It's unselfish. And then here's, and tell them, celebrate often, meaning, boy, tell them, have a big graduation party when you're residents and let them be a part of that. Talk about your residency. Pray for your residency. And then I just want to say, believe big for maximum impact. I hadn't put this together, but the other day I sat down and I called Beej and I said, how many guys were in our first residency and where have they planted and this, and I just started writing this down. Well, I mean, we're not a big deal at the summit, but we've helped start 10 churches in the last 4 years. Well, that's pretty cool. I mean, way to go, God, right? And I normally wouldn't have thought of how this could. Now we're thinking, how many churches can we start in the next 20 years? If we can train 5 residents a year, that's at least 20 churches. And how many churches will they start? So I think we need to think bigger than we're thinking about. Can I just grow the church at 6600 Crystal Hill Road in North Little Rock? Can it grow way beyond that through church planning and church multiplication? And the last thing that I would say, this is a bonus, don't stop. even when you fail. Because you're going to have failures. I mean, you're going to, Jacksonville was a failure for us. We started out the first year with 2 residents. One of them we had to ask to step down. We could have just stopped there and said, well, this doesn't work real good. Or we can say that was a learning moment, and now we know stuff we didn't know before, and so we're gonna move from that and get better. And I think we have over the last 4 years. I think we're way better now than we were in the beginning. So just don't give up on this matter of church planting, regardless of what's happening along the way.